talk about your latest venture.
Yes. Well, I couldn't help myself, and I wrote a book, which exists as a manuscript, and I'm looking for a publisher. But the book is called The American Automobile From Flivver to Furious.
That's a long period there.
Yeah, I try to make it a comprehensive story of American cars and a continuous narrative that starts in 1893 with the Duryea brothers of Massachusetts and continues right up to Tesla. I visited the factory on Media Day 10 years ago. And
so with such a comprehensive history of the American automobile, was there was there a big picture lesson that you learned?
Yeah, really, I think the number one lesson is how much suffering the automotive pioneers endured in many cases, in order to bring their vision about. An example is a guy named Byron Carter from Jackson, Michigan, and he created the Carter car with the friction drive, which had, instead of a sliding gear transmission or planetary transmission, it had some friction discs inside that engaged, and I don't know how to tell you how it worked, but it was an alternative drivetrain. And Billy Durant, when he was putting General Motors together, bought Carter car. He kind of famously said, "How was I supposed to know what the engineers were going to tell me next? One day it's the friction drive, and the next day it's 2-cycle engines. And so I was forgetting them all." And so Carter car was part of original General Motors. But by that time, I think that was in 2009, Byron Carter had perished because he was going across the Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit, and Belle Isle is a city park in the Detroit River, and a woman's car had stopped. So he got out to crank it, and there was that kickback problem, and it did, and it broke his arm and jaw, and poor Byron Carter died within a week of pneumonia. So that's one example of the suffering. And
I know this story, and his death inspired a pretty amazing innovation.
That's right. And it was through his friendship with Henry Leland, and by this time they were getting involved with Charles Kettering. So Leland felt so terrible that I think it was a Cadillac that had caused the accident, and he felt so terrible about having developed the car that claimed Byron Carter's life that he pushed for a solution, and they collaborated with Kettering on developing electric start, so self-starting cars. We had by then learned how to make cars in huge quantities, but they weren't that usable. You had to be a wizard to run one. And so two big problems were, how do you start the engine and how do you change the gears? So the immediate quest was to invent self-starting or perfect self-starting. And Kettering, going back, he was from National Cash Register in Dayton, which is a leading company. They knew how to make precision parts in huge quantities, and a lot of innovation there. He figured out how to put an electric motor in a cash register and make things operate, automation to some degree. And then he and partners founded Delco, Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, and that was a great resource, which General Motors ended up buying later and moving to Detroit. So there was an example of this innovation that was a response to a tragedy, and it also solved the problem of now suddenly women could more easily drive cars, operate them.
And it certainly fit with Cadillac's role as a premier automotive marque.
Right.
And in case people haven't heard my episode on the men who built General Motors, you can check that out. But I talked about Henry Leland. So Leland was an investor in the Henry Ford Company, which...
that was Ford's second company. I think his first one was named after Detroit.
The Detroit Automobile Works or something like that. And Leland took what was the remains of the Henry Ford Company that had gone into receivership, and he reconstituted it as Cadillac.
Right. With partnership from Murphy. That would be William Murphy, I think.
Right. And so, I talked about that in that episode, but this story, which is in your book, is a perfect example of stuff that I just eat up, right? Because there are so many fascinating tales of trial and error and
also, just personalities had to mesh, and Murphy and Leland grew tired of Henry Ford, kind of fiddling around and not producing cars. And then, what sealed it was that his old 999 race car that he said, "I'll do this," and they're waiting to make some money on their investment. And so they took off, and they founded a new company, Cadillac, and then later Leland got discontent with something that was going on in Cadillac, and with his nephew or son, they started another company, Lincoln.
Right. Which later became part of Ford Motor Company.
1922, it's the centennial of the purchase.
And so it all comes full circle.
Yeah, no kidding. So the next big usability quest was shifting gears. And it was difficult for a lot of people. And, natural thing is what could be better? An automatic transmission. And that was development on that began in the early 30s at General Motors. And one of the young engineers who was involved in that project was named Ed Cole, who went on to have a glorious career at General Motors.
Small block Chevy.
Yeah, I mean, even before that, he was always on these cutting edge things. Like once they got an automatic transmission, the Hydra-matic, around 1939, it was in the Oldsmobile. They also put it in battle tanks right away. Cadillac built tanks, for the Army, and it was a big improvement to put I think they also put a Cadillac V8 in it at that time.
It was the M3 Stewart tank, in fact, and it had twin Cadillac V8s.
Right, each with its own automatic transmission.
Yep.
And I suppose they each ran one side of the vehicle. I don't know much more about that, but yeah.
Fascinating. So Ed Cole.
Yeah, he became, during World War II, the chief designer, I believe, for military vehicles in Cadillac. And then after the war, they went back to civilian duty, and their next goal was the overhead valve Cadillac V8, which introduced in 49. And he was so successful that they wanted him at Chevy, which was, kind of an old ladies division there. And Ford had the new 49. Ford, it was pretty hot stuff. So he became ultimately chief engineer at Chevy, and their big project was the 55 Chevy, which was all new, and it included the overhead valve V8, the Chevy small block engine, which, was lighter in weight than the Cadillac, and it was easier and cheaper to build, but it was also kind of, you would say, adaptable. It was really designed maybe with an eye for motorsports and enthusiast users to create their own, heads and fueling systems and whatnot. So it was a real breakthrough, and then Cole's career he was golden after that. He could do anything, right? He became general manager of the Chevrolet division. And what was their next big pursuit? The Corvair. They had to answer the Volkswagen, and there'd been a lot of pressure during the 50s about, George Romney was one who led that campaign against inefficiency and heavyweight cars. Romney was, CEO of American Motors, and the Rambler line was quite successful. Smaller, compact, smaller engines, and they kept winning the mobile fuel
economy
efficiency runs. Yeah. And so he had some authority behind him, and so Cole thought this was the answer to the Corvair, and really that was the beginning of a number of calamities that he was involved with, and right up to the Vega, and he was also pushing for the rotary engine during the 60s, and I think there are one Corvette mock-up with a rotary, and so he was trying all this cutting edge stuff, and we're still doing that today. I think we overcomplicate, because Henry Ford had it figured out. And actually I'm reading this novel right now called The Flivver King, a story of Ford America.
By the way, before you go on, Ronald, maybe we should explain what a flivver is, because it's a term that's pretty antiquated now. A lot of people don't know.
Yeah, it was one of those words. Upton Sinclair says the Model T began to get pet names. Tin Lizzie, Flivver, and I can't remember the others, but Flivver was very commonly used, and there was even a Ford Flivver aircraft, which was their attempt to make a flying car, basically, for commuting around, a small, lightweight, 2-cylinder engine at first, and that was the name of the product, the Flivver. But there were only 4 or 5 prototypes made, and it ended tragically when their test pilot crashed into the Atlantic Ocean.
That was that's pretty symbolic of the arrogance of the industrial age, or the machine age, right? You think of that movie, Fritz Lang, Metropolis.
I've never seen that, but I know of it, yeah.
Right. This mechanized utopia type idea. And a lot of these guys, they sort of got an ego trip about it, I think. They had solved so many problems, especially Henry Ford, who's, half the cars in the world at one time were Model Ts. Mm-hmm. If that doesn't inflate your ego, what would?
Right. Well, Upton Sinclair, who was a very famous writer, maybe not too well remembered today, but his 1906 novel, The Jungle, was an expose about the meatpacking industry, and it led to passage of federal legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and he went on for decades writing that same type of novel, like, about different industries, coal, oil, automotive. So he wrote this book, The Flivver King, a story of Ford America, and he documents the story of a common man who worked for Ford, and then tells Ford's story as well, and how he became that billionaire with the big vision for everything. And from the beginning, like, he talks about how Ford discovered vanadium steel alloy and how cars would be lighter, stronger, and cheaper. And we've gotten, that's really all that we need, but we always have to add these systems and more of this and more of that, and we end up with, like we were talking about, the 9,000-pound Hummer EV, and it's grotesque in a way. And again, what I've already told you about my indoctrination by my father about lightweight vehicles, and in the spirit of Colin Chapman's Lotus and Ford, and even Raymond Loewy was commenting on our cars are getting so heavy. Raymond Loewy, a designer who worked a lot for International Harvester and Studebaker, and there was a designer at General Motors, probably the first woman in automotive design. Her name was Helena Rother, and she said lightness is the essence of design. So there's almost been a consensus about it, and could throw in Romney as well, but somehow we end up bigger and bigger. And so Cole, his answer was aluminum engines in the Vega, and ever more exotic, manufacturing technologies and stuff. And it kind of came to naught, but nevertheless, his career, is almost unsurpassable. And an interesting corollary to his story is, I'm a big student of the Knudsen's, and I have read their papers at the Detroit Public Library, the National Automotive History Collection, and there were two of them. The first was Bill Knudsen, Big Bill Knudsen. He was 6'3", 6'4", big shambling type of guy, and he had come from Denmark as an immigrant in 1900 and worked his way from the shipyards in New York to the Kime Bicycle Works in Buffalo, and then Henry Ford discovered him and brought him to Detroit. And Knudsen oversaw the opening of Ford's branch factories all over North America, and then even into Cadiz, Spain, and Copenhagen, and a couple others in Europe. So he really had a big hand in helping the Ford Motor Company to expand, but there was some kind of falling out, and he left Ford Motor Company and a $50,000 a year job, and he ran a manufacturing company for about a year, and then from across town, the General Motors people came in. Chevrolet was really in trouble at that time. There was a post-World War I recession, and also we mentioned Charles F. Kettering had become head of GM's R&D. He was pushing for the copper-cooled Chevy, this air-cooled engine. I don't know. It had copper fins all over it, and it was really difficult to make and expensive. And they brought Knudsen into Chevy at $50,000 a year, and he kind of eased the copper-cooled Chevy out of production, out of the plans, and just went with a sound reliable running gear. And then they kind of did a Frenchy body design, with a lot of trim and stuff, and it was successful. And by the end of the 20s, they actually were back and forth with Ford in sales leadership, and a tremendous, Knudsen, with his Danish accent, he was famous for telling the team at Chevy, "I want one for one," meaning match Ford sales. And that was to some Chevy dealers who all stood up and roared their approval. And so Big Bill Knudsen became president of General Motors in 1937 after the strikes, and Alfred P. Sloan, he didn't like the UAW at all, and he kind of felt defeated, I think, by how things turned out, because Washington got involved. And so he just became executive chairman after that and let Knudsen run the company. But that was only for less than 3 years, and World War II started, and Franklin D. Roosevelt said, we need to increase our production effort, and the Office of War Production had a new chief. They brought Knudsen from Detroit and he's the guy who went out to every factory in North America and said, okay, you're building howitzers and you are going to build, armored personnel carriers. And he coordinated that whole effort, made sure they got the materials, and really led the whole arsenal of democracy, and had a glorious, actually the political part didn't go so well in Washington because there was some infighting with the bureaucrats. But
that's a shock.
Yeah, and he was an outsider, $1 a year man, and they thought he should be more of a figurehead, I suppose. But when he came back to Detroit after in 46, he was greeted as a hero, and they also coincidentally had the Golden Jubilee celebration of the automobile in 46, because that was 50 years since Charles Brady King had become the first person to drive a car on the streets of Detroit, and that was the beginning of the industry. So they really made Knudsen the exalted figure there, and he really had a glorious send out, you know. And so meanwhile, he had a family, and his oldest son was named, in the Danish tradition, Semon Emil Knudsen. And he became known as Bunky because when the daughter came along, and the daughters all had names like Tootie and, you know...
cutesy names?
Yeah, those diminutives. And so the first daughter comes home, and she's in the nursery with mom, and dad and son bunk together. They were bunkies. I guess that was kind of a term in current use during World War I era and after. And so he became known as Bunky Knudsen. And he looked at his dad and said, I want to be president of General Motors too. And he did. He took all the right steps. You know, he went to MIT, but he came home in the summers and he worked on the line at Pontiac. And so he knew how cars were put together and military stuff. And he also knew what a good factory was like and how it should operate. And, you know, he went to work, and I think they implemented statistical process control, and he had a lot to do with that. And then he worked at Allison Division in Indianapolis, where he found an inefficient factory with too much stuff stored on the premises and dirty, and, you know, people had a lackadaisical attitude, and his progress there was good. So the next job was as manager of the Pontiac Division in 56. And again, it was a real sleepy division. If you think about the mid-50s Pontiacs, you know, nothing much was happening.
Kind of a dressed up Chevrolet, really.
Yeah. But they always, from the 30s, they had their Pontiac Chieftain emblem,
right,
and their speed streaks on the side of the car. Well, he said, let's get rid of that stuff. And he hired some new engineering talent. One was a senior engineer named Elliot Pete. He was known as Pete Estes. And you know who the other one is, right?
Well, let me think. Pontiac history.
He was a young guy from Castech High in Detroit and Lawrence Technological University. And he had gone to work at Packard, but Packard was dying, and he was involved in developing the Ultramatic automatic transmission at Packard and rather distinguished himself. And so his name was John Z. DeLorean.
Oh my goodness.
And he was part of the team with Estes and Knudsen. And Knudsen had it all down. I mean, he knew good advertising, so they started doing these fantastic ads with illustrations by, they were called Fitzpatrick and Van Kaufman. Unbelievable stuff. A guy named Rob Kyle has written a book about it.
I've seen the book. It's amazing. So the artwork is quite stylized. If you think long, low, and sleek, and rectilinear.
They were perfect to capture that for Pontiac, because then the engineering program was
wide track,
big engines, low, wide, the wide track Pontiac, and a whole series of great ad campaigns. And
by the way, it really fit in with the direction that Bill Mitchell took GM styling in the 60s, which was, let's get rid of all the chintz and chrome and clean everything up.
Absolutely, yeah. So they, like I said, they threw the Chieftain away, and Knudsen took Pontiac to third in the industry. Sales were incredible, but see, the thing was, he was always one half step behind Ed Cole on the corporate ladder. So Cole's already general manager of the Chevy division, which was the really good job and the biggest job. So then Cole moved up to become group VP for all automotive divisions, and and Bunky Knudsen gets elevated to be general manager of Chevy. He goes right back to his formula: stick in the biggest engine that you can find, and we'll really make this thing go. We'll call them super sports, and we'll stick that. And he initiated development of the Mark IV V8, the 427 cubic inch engine, and we'll stick that in a Corvette. I mean, it's outrageous what they did, right? And in '67, Ed Cole now becomes president of General Motors, which Knudsen thought he was going to get that job. And when it didn't happen, we know this because he kept a diary.
Oh.
Right, and that's part of the Knudsen papers in Detroit. And he was really beside himself, and he saw it coming too. So he left General Motors, which unheard of, except that his father had left Ford and gone to General Motors decades earlier, and he became the new president at another company that was challenged in the management department, and that was Ford. And so he moves to Ford. Lee Iacocca's tearing his hair out because he had just led the introduction of the Mustang, and man, he should have had that job. And so I think he devoted himself over the next 19 months to just every day was coming in to get rid of Bunky Knudsen, and meanwhile Knudsen's doing his thing again, the 428s and the 429s and the Boss and the Mach, and Iacocca sees his sweet delicate Mustang getting developed into this big heavy thing, and so he was president of Ford for just 19 months, and then there was this utterly humiliating public press conference to announce that he was being fired. I would say Bunky's comeuppance was, a vindication for Iacocca, who then went around saying, Henry Ford famously said that history is bunk. Well, today Bunky is history. Yeah, and Knudsen went away to Cleveland and ran the White Motor Company and made trucks and tractors for 10 more years. And
reminds me of Ransom Olds, who got ousted from Oldsmobile and ended up building REO commercial trucks.
Yeah.
And some cars.
The REO Speedwagon.
That's right.
And yeah, they built a line of cars.
Yep.
They were quite successful, and they built trucks well into the 50s, I think.
Ronald, thanks for telling me these stories today. The book sounds terrific. It's right up my alley, something I want to read. I hope to read it soon. And people can catch up with you at Ronald Ahrens, AHRENS.com.
That is correct.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.